Well, joining me now to discuss Trump's decision to exclude Viktor Orban's country from the sanctions imposed on Russia is international affairs analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to have you this weekend, Dr. Marek. Do you think Trump's exemption of Hungary undermines the effectiveness of the U.S. sanctions on Russia?
It does to a small degree, yes, because on the one hand, he's saying now he's going to move to help Ukraine and he's going to bring in sanctions. On the other hand, he's saying, well, not in the case of Hungary. Well, if not in the case of Hungary, doubtless there may be others who think it will apply to them. And this kind of takes away the threat and the actions he's making. And it's not the first time this has happened either. What works well in business, flexibility, and the ability to take in exceptions, does not work very well in politics, where people looked for a solid, firm policy. And of course, by giving Orban right from his own lips this exemption, the implication is he's not taking the sanctions as seriously as others hoped he would.
So, Marek, how might this move impact the EU's efforts to phase out Russian energy imports by 2028? And could it create tension between the US-EU on, energy policy?
It does, because, and not only in here, in this respect, Orban has been a consistent thorn in EU's side, and it means that the EU does not speak with one voice. And because the EU prides itself on being a group of nations, like-minded, working together, it takes away from the EU image as well. And therefore, it is a problem for them. Moreover, he has vetoes and has used them or has threatened to use them, all of which means is that the message going to Russia is muted, in fact, slightly distorted. And so therefore, in this respect, yes, Orban has succeeded in denting the EU as well.
Now, I would go straight to the headlines that we got this evening about 6 dying as Russia hits sites in Ukraine, talking about residential and energy sites. Can you link that to this conversation we're having, Russia doing thus?
Yeah, for some reason, Russia is quite determined to hit Ukraine's energy suppliers. It's on the basis that the Ukrainian people, presumably, will, as the Russians see it, eventually cease to support Zelensky and sue for peace. It has to be said, this strategy hasn't worked up till now, and it's very dubious whether it will ever work. People can put up with lack of electricity, cold or not cold. After all, literally, within their grandparents' time, there was no electricity in many places owing to the vicissitudes of World War II, and many people, therefore, are by no means as dependent upon electricity as in the West. In particular, one thinks of areas of USA or Western Europe, where the lack of electricity will be a catastrophe, spelled with a capital C, of course, whereas in Eastern Europe, it's not that bad. And to be quite honest, the electricity never worked fully all day, every day, anywhere in many countries in Eastern Europe. So this strategy is likely to fail. However, it does show how important energy is, since we're discussing oil on the one hand, electricity and that sort of thing on the other here in Ukraine. So therefore, yes, the strategy is linked to that respect, yes.
Now, Dr. Marek, does this exemption also signal that Viktor Orban has significant influence over U.S. foreign policy? And could this impact Hungary's relations with other EU member states?
To say he has an influence, yeah, a slight influence. To be quite honest, more like-minded thinking than an actual influence that he has on Donald Trump. Both of them just don't see the war in black-white terms with Russia as all evil and Ukraine as all good. Orban has made it quite clear he's thinking of Hungary's interests first and foremost. And moreover, he and Donald Trump have like-minded views about migrants and law and order and other affairs. He is, in effect, one of Donald Trump's key allies. And in that respect, Donald Trump likes him, and he's got, therefore, someone in Europe who can put forward Donald Trump's point of view. So from Trump's point of view and Orban, this is all to the good. Incidentally, Orban has good relations with Putin as well. So, I mean, he's got two of the most powerful men behind him. Now, that puts him out of kilter with the EU, but he's simply not worried about it. He has stated this over and over. He is on Hungary's side. He's carrying out Hungary's interests. And he's by no means alone, please note. Many of his views are echoed by other countries, Slovakia, Czechs now. And so therefore, he is a thorn, will continue to be one. But the very fact he's acting in this way makes one other scenario quite interesting, because I've stated in my books that Russia, if it attacks at all, will be attacking Poland. You can see why they're not going to be attacking Hungary in any shape or form, because Hungary is, so to speak, at least a half ally in Russia's eyes.
So how might, Hungary's reliance on Russian energy impact its energy security? And are there alternative energy sources that Hungary could explore after, this decision is made?
To be honest, they could explore, but the real point is, it's not just a question of finding oil, it's a question of the price. Hungary is benefiting from what Germany benefited for decades, cheap raw materials, in this case oil. It really makes a huge difference to the economy. And therefore, please remember, in April 2026, Orban is up for the polls. He's got to go and prove himself before the electorate. And the fact they've had a cheap and warm Christmas is going to certainly go down well. And therefore, all this is, from his point of view, very important. And looking for other energy sources, well, expensive, hard to get at. Why should he bother when the Russians are very keen on supplying him with all the gas and oil he needs?
So what does this exemption say about the US's commitment to enforcing sanctions on Russia? And could it impact the US's leadership or the role in international affairs?
Well, USA's role has in any case come in under question from 2 points of view. The Russians and the Chinese, apart from the fact there's a war being waged, are setting up a different way of being paid. That is to say, they no longer will make use of the dollar. This is already a huge blow to America's leadership. And number two, the EU has made it quite clear, because Donald Trump isn't interested in being so much a leader of NATO as simply a leader of the USA, a very powerful nation, that is no longer really in that leadership role as previously America was. And so therefore, that isn't the major issue. There is a saying, TACO, Trump always chickens out, which is current in the USA. And it's really this aspect which is the most important. It's very hard for Donald Trump to be, if you like, very decisive about his sanctions if he's going to grant exemptions. And yes, it has detracted from his previous sentence, if only because other nations think they might get also an exemption from him. And so therefore, yes, it does detract from his luster and from America's important role.
Right. So again about the exemption, but now bringing in the Ukraine. Could this whole scenario affect Ukraine's position in negotiations with Russia? And might it impact the US's ability to support Ukraine?
I think it's more of a fact that Donald Trump simply doesn't like very much Zelensky and supporting Ukraine, just writing out billions of dollars and sending them over there all the time in the form of aid. I don't think that's so much a direct effect as simply another example of Donald Trump's reticence in helping Ukraine. Is, so to speak, is a confirmatory signal that underneath Donald Trump doesn't want the war and really is not interested in any of Ukraine's war aims, such as driving the Russians out of Ukraine. And therefore, in this respect, yes, there is a difference for Ukraine. It is yet another signal that their only real allies are going to be the Europeans, but they're a minor ally in terms of help or aid or military compared to the Americans. So yes, it does weaken Ukraine's role slightly. The point is, of course, from Russia's point of view, it's good news. And further, although, of course, recently the Kaliningrad enclave, the EU says is blockading it, which takes the tarnish, I think, of the good news here with Hungary. So it does have other problems, Russia, facing it. However, in respect to Hungary, good news for Russia and for America. In one respect, it shows Zelensky is not going to help him achieve his war aims, and therefore he should compromise. That's the impression I have from this.
So does this whole thing affect Hungary's role within the European Union, particularly given its opposition to EU sanctions on Russia?
It strengthens it enormously. But the fact of the matter is that Hungary is now a top player, if you like. There's the EU one side, the rest of them, which features France and Germany and the also rans with them. And there's Hungary on the other, and Hungary is standing firm. And so actually it adds to Orban's prestige, and in that sense will help him in the elections. Um, in respect to the EU, it's now quite clear that the EU cannot bulldoze Hungary, because if Trump and Putin are supporting him economically and his decisions, it's going to be hard for the EU to do anything about Hungary. To be quite honest, the question is whether the EU shouldn't be thinking in terms of working without Hungary, because there's such a huge gap between their views on this and incidentally other issues as well, such as other liberal aims which the EU has, which Orban does not share and has made sure do not appear on the Hungarian agenda at all.
So how do you think the EU will respond to this exemption, and will it lead to a re-evaluation of EU energy policy?
I think the EU will be dismayed. To be quite honest, it shows that Donald Trump is just not taking them seriously, and that, if you like, it's showing up the EU to not be so much a band of nations as a rabble, disorganized rabble. Some people shouting one thing, some people shouting the other. And so it is a bad moment for the EU. Incidentally, NATO is not much better off either, but the EU in particular here has been absolutely shown up. And for the EU now, it has to work out quite how it's going to cope with Orban, because Donald Trump has made his support for Orban quite clear. Putin supports him as well. And the question is, what can the EU do about it? And the answer is, we shall see, because one of the problems is that Germany and France historically were also not very enthusiastic about the Ukrainian war. So it's not clear precisely what, in conclusion, they're going to come to.
So do you think Trump's decision reflects a shift in U.S. foreign policy priorities? And if so, what implications might this have for global governance?
Well, unfortunately, no one's in charge of the world, so global governance doesn't exist. Rather, what exists is that America's views are the most prevalent, and certainly every nation has to measure up with what America thinks or does not think, apart from, of course, its indirect influence and sometimes military via the CIA on governments. So in that sense, USA is important. What it does show is that Donald Trump remains as incalculable as ever, and that he simply seems to find it impossible to have a firm policy. And because he has no firm policy, this is a green light to countries like Russia, because the implication is, of course, that if they carry on the way they're going, all Donald Trump's going to do is bark. There will be no bite. And that is, of course, precisely what politicians who try to influence world affairs don't want. But Donald Trump is, of course, quite oblivious to this. And he has no real, I think, strategy for leading anything apart from leading America to out of its mess with the foreign trade and trying to stop the war. But I don't think it'll be that serious, simply because it's not the first time he has shown himself incapable of carrying out a firm policy, and which is why Russia is persevering on.
Right. Now, before I let you go, Dr. Marek, how might this exemption also impact the upcoming Hungarian elections, and could it affect Orban's chances of re-election?
It's a boost for him. It's an absolute boost. Orban has succeeded in having friends, to some extent, with Russia and America. Well, America's supporting his point of view. So whereas the opposition to Orban's rule is constantly whittering on about Europe and about and liberal values and things like that, Orban is putting bread on the table, if you like. There it is, cheap oil, support from America. And therefore, he's going to carry on with his policies. And this has been a huge prestige-building event for him, which, if everything works out and he carries on getting the cheap fuel, most likely will help him to power past in the 2026 April elections.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Marek, for making our time to join us to discuss the exemption of Hungary from sanctions that involves, well, Ukraine and its territory. Dr. Marek is a RISE international affairs analyst.